in the world that we all live in, there's a great deal of risk, a great deal of reward. And I always like to give them confidence that we are on the side of growing the rewards. I view my success as only if they're succeeding. So I want to make sure the people I work with feel tangible and personal and authentic professional success. And so if they're rising in the rewards and the risks are maintained or managed, then we all will succeed. And to me, our community succeeds. That's the other part, is that I think of the LGBTQ economy means that we're contributing to all of it. The nonprofit side, the profit side, we're stakeholders, investors, we're entrepreneurs, we're consumers. I want to have us succeed in all of those identities so that we are seen for the whole person we are.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, someone who is a friend and mentor of mine, Bob Witeck, President of Witeck Communications, who for nearly 4 decades has been a pioneering communication strategist dedicated to the advancement of LGBTQ communities around the world. Here are 3 things I think you should know about Bob. Number 1, his firm Witeck Communications is the longest established LGBTQ-owned business enterprise certified by the NGLCC, the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Number 2, American Demographics magazine selected Bob as one of the 25 global leaders who've made significant contributions to the worlds of demographics, market research, media, and trend spotting for Bob's early work on America's LGBT population. And number 3, Bob co-authored the first book on LGBT marketing, Business Inside Out, and was the first LGBT consultant retained in 2010 by the U.S. Census to help inspire LGBT participation in that year's count. Bob, you've been called many things: a pioneer in the world of LGBT research and marketing, an inspiring business leader, a mentor to many, and today we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you so much. To me, Anthony, it's a joy. I'm a big fan of your work, and being engaged in this conversation is a punctuation mark on my career. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, you bet. I mean, it's so exciting to have you. I have known about you and your work before I personally knew you, because you're pretty well known in many circles. And when we think about influence, I mean, you have made a tremendous impact and influence on the business community when it comes to how they see the LGBT market. When you started your company, I mean, no one was really researching or figuring out how to adapt to the LGBTQ consumer. So I want to just start by asking, how did you influence corporations to see this as an opportunity?
It's a great question, because I remember the early days, even asking the questions was you were often met with a wall of ignorance or fear. And I remember one call, in fact, I made to a think tank in Washington that whose specialty they were driven by working in employee benefits. And I made a call to a good friend there, and I said, how many questions or inquiries have you had about domestic partner benefits? And this is the mid-1990s. And they said, well, actually none. And I was puzzled why yet corporations weren't even driven to understand the differences between unmarried partners, in most cases same-sex couples, as opposed to their heterosexual married couples. Those were kind of the fundamental issues about talent in corporate America that we had to face because we wanted parity. Companies were losing an opportunity to hire, retain, and promote the best talent if they weren't able to offer parity or equity in terms of their offerings. But during that time, started working early on in the 90s with American Airlines. And at that point, one of the very, very earliest meetings we had with some of the senior executives was very simple. One of them said, "Do you think we have many gay people at American Airlines?" Now, of course, this is a Fortune 100 company, over 100,000 at the time employees. And I was a little puzzled that it was so opaque to some of the folks in the room. And so you had to sort of dive into that, understanding that they just don't know. And they don't even know what they don't know. And so to me, we were driven from the very beginning of our consulting roles to try to drive data, to try to begin to answer questions that any business would ask. How many gay people are there? What are their households like? Are they alike? Are they different than other people? What are their drivers? What are their barriers? What are their boundaries? So we wanted to dispel the myths and eliminate as much fear and really engage honestly. So data was extremely important at the outset.
Okay, I want to ask some questions about data because first of all, a lot of folks in the workforce, I mean, not that this isn't the case at all now, but especially then, were very fearful of identifying as, gay or lesbian, which is probably kind of how we thought about it at that time. And so how did you get the data to make sure that you're getting, you're accurately communicating the picture to your corporate clients as one example?
Anthony, that's a great question because as you know, good data drives out bad data. And at the outset, we were more or less hidebound by things like, early 1 in 10 mythologies that 1 in 10 people are gay, let alone lesbian or bisexual or transgender, all the above. But if you break it down and say that asking the question means one, getting the question asked correctly to begin with, and then also making it safe and relatively anonymous for people to be able to self-respond. And so data sets at the time were just beginning to go online. It was the digital channels that changed and transformed communications. And at that time, one of the most prestigious and important research organizations, I think, in the world, the Harris Poll, responded to our request. We said, do you want to champion and work with us to begin modeling survey research or market research that actually could ask the question? Because we knew if we didn't get it right in methodology, you didn't begin to ask it correctly and give the confidence and safety in numbers. The LGBTQ community, largely speaking, it gravitated online in a hurry because they felt that sense of confidence and safety. In fact, overly so. I think actually they over-indexed and they showed up online in ways that probably maybe overcounted even their actual proportions, but it also gave them what they thought to be a safe place to connect.
Yeah. And then after you collected that data, so you're learning what matters to employees and where these employees are and, consumer sentiments, everything that you're looking at, data can be very influential to decision makers. And at the same time, sometimes it can be like, a spreadsheet's not always the most persuasive thing. So how did you pair that data with stories?
You're exactly right. You could not end with data, but you had to begin with it. So you had to give them a sense of confidence that it was data that was comparable to other data sets they like. So in other words, we wanted to work with also the researcher who studied all markets. We didn't want to isolate ourselves to LGBTQ people. So to me, it's not important to know just how we behave or respond behaviorally, but compared to our peers, compared to others. And so very important to me was to make sure that, for example, I always say to people in the marketplace, the soap we buy or the hamburgers we buy or the variety of ordinary products, we're probably no different than anybody else around us. We are moved by the same messaging and needs. But there are certain things that we probably over-index in because We have needs or preferences that are slightly different. So we're looking for differences to begin with. But again, you're right about the other part of it is that when we found gaps in data, you wanted personal and human stories to emphasize. For example, a person who is denied health insurance for their partner, why wouldn't they leave the community and go elsewhere, or go to an employer or a competitor that offered parity and benefits and said, my family matters to them? And we began to understand that brands could, mark a trail of both talent and consumer preference because they visibly demonstrated leadership in acknowledging and engaging. It was amazing watching, even in the 90s. I remember with the CEO of American Airlines at a gay event, he had said he'd never heard so many people come up to him to thank him. Most people, when they want a first class upgrade or they want to complain about their trip to Topeka. But he, for the first time, felt as a CEO, the gay community thought that he had already told them they matter. And by telling them they matter, they said, I'm not invisible anymore. Very powerful feeling.
Yeah. I mean, that must have made an impact on
him.
It
did on him. It did on him. Yeah, absolutely.
There was a time when marketing was really centered around what a company sells. And now I think we all recognize that companies are communicating with consumers what they stand for. Sometimes you see ads, for example, that don't talk about the product at all. It's much more about the values of a brand. Love to hear your perspective, having worked on this for 30 years, how you've seen that change and the rationale that maybe corporate leaders bring to that. And in particular, I'm thinking about this interplay between how consumers influence the brand and the companies, and then vice versa, how what those brands do also influences the consumer.
Absolutely right. I believe, I don't know that I have the evidence for it yet, but I think it's the gay marketplace that drove definition of values-based marketing. Because for the first time, we weren't really having to differentiate so much pricing, quality, affordability, all the other attributes of a product. We just had to convey that you mattered, that you were not visible, that you were cared for. And it made such a deep emotional reward for so many that it changed their buying patterns. It reminds me, Anthony, thinking back at my age, I can think of this in the 60s when the African-American civil rights movement was quite palpable. It was all over the nation in terms of fomenting demonstrations and advocacy and lobbying and frankly, conflict. But at that time, companies then were really afraid of leaning into the civil rights movement. They thought that they were going to end up with a divide. And I remember an episode of Mad Men, when in fact, one of the ad agency guys in the 60s was talking to a man of color who is elevator operator and asking him about his choice of TVs, things like that. It just struck me that two things. Nobody had ever talked to a Black consumer about their preferences, and they hadn't even included them in focus groups, thinking that they were a completely different consumer set. At the same time, they were just afraid of controversy. They didn't go near it. Now, it's also true of the gay market. There was a fear of controversy. I think if you had talked in these terms that I'm talking right now in the 60s or 70s, it would have been just awfully premature. I think they would have risked not so much blowback as dissonance. People would say, why are they doing that? These are criminal behaviors. These are aberrant people. But visibility was changing. And by the time the 90s and certainly 2000 came along, gay people came out in public places, and companies began to realize that they were missing an opportunity, but they wanted to get it right. And they did want to take care of risk. Risk was still a big issue.
What are some of the things that you're proudest of when you look back at the work that you have done and the impact that you've made?
The thing that I think, Anthony, I take very seriously is that I want to say I personally am happy when a company grows market share of any kind. In other words, they really deepen their customer brand and their loyalty of their customers. But more important to me, actually, is when they actually doing the work inside and outside at the same time. If they're not addressing the workplace itself, they can't have authenticity in the marketplace. They have got to develop an understanding and a very visible, tangible connection with their workforce and their associates. If they drive a talent, an equity boundaries in their talent, and they create a place where they can show a workplace that is truly accepting, I think their outward behaviors are so much more authentic and so much more compelling. Little known, one of the things I am very proud of is in 1996, we actually did the very first prototype corporate equality index. We took the 50 largest employers in the Washington region, the very large names that you all know, the brands, and we called them because that's how you did it. You didn't get online, and you called them and asked them, do you have non-discrimination policies? Do you have equity in spousal benefits or partner benefits? Very basic workplace needs. And first of all, we did find out that we had a fairly progressive business community in the Washington area. So we had good progress, not at the 50% mark, but along the way. But the other thing, Anthony, we found is they were so intimidated by being asked. We ended up talking to sometimes their attorneys. They were wondering why we would even ask these questions. Today they're no-brainers, right? But if you're talking the 1990s, these are companies that found it a little bit intimidating to be asked.
It's almost like back then it was a little bit of a secret too, right? Because like now these things would probably be in an annual report on their website or something like that. And then
you can capture that information as looking for a job anywhere.
Yeah.
But you didn't have access to that knowledge. Although, frankly, I'd say they probably didn't have it for any other community. They weren't really reaching into people with disabilities or people who are veterans or other groups. People want to see themselves. When they look at a brand, they say, do I fit? Do I belong? Do they connect?
We talked about how, research and data are really important ways to influence. We talked about storytelling. With that example of the prototype of the Corporate Equality Index, I think you're sort of also adding in another dimension there, which is, peer pressure, competition, transparency. I think, there's a few ways you could look at it. When folks get compared to one another, it, kind of encourages them to raise the bar. And that seems like a very powerful tool to wield for influence. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's funny. I love the way you framed that, because one of the things I tell people is because there's been a myth of gay affluence is that we have more money. We don't. We are no wealthier than the other population. Clearly, that's not the case. But one of the things, and I thought that people would often say that we'll spend more money with a brand that we trust and we respect, and that probably is true in many cases, because we do want to put our money, our something that we really value, into brands that really connect with us, and we don't want to spend them with people we feel are hostile or indifferent. But that said, I was thinking of American Airlines once again, and you think airlines basically do one thing: they carry us hopefully safely every time from point A to point B, and that's what they all do. So the difference in flying is not always competitive. You're not getting the seats are uncomfortable and they're too close, unless you're in the elite suites. But along the way, you want to know that when you do board that flight, that they're going to look at you as somebody they care about. And that was the difference, I think, with American's trajectory 30 years ago, was flying into the skies, making it clear that they really did want us on their flights. One of the things that we did, an interesting little ad campaign with them back in the mid 2000s, I think it was, we took an old airline vintage poster, the kind that show people all dressed up and they're getting on flights and they're going off to some fun place. We took those images and we changed them to reflect same-sex couples. So we took that 1950s or 60s, the excitement of travel and flying, and we put gay couples into it. And they were startling and loving and very meaningful. They became collectible. In fact, they put these in their gift shop at American Airlines so people could actually buy them. I don't know if they're still extant, but they're probably on eBay today.
Oh, that's great. What a great example. Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about the perspective that you've brought as, a consultant and a partner to corporations. The way you influence as a consultant through data and storytelling and showing results is very different from how you might influence when you're in a board member or a governance role. And you have tremendous board experience from GLAAD and GLSEN to the Matthew Shepard Foundation and the Human Rights Campaign's Business Council. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role that you play when you're serving on a board and the leadership that you exert, navigating toward the future in that role.
Great question. The thing I try to think about in a board role is purpose. And it's still the same thing. I think it drives me with consulting with companies is driving purpose. So some of these organizations like GLSEN and GLAAD, I was on one of the first boards for either one back in the 90s. And during that time, you wanted to clearly define their purpose because over time, you wanted to know whether or not you could achieve their vision. Is America or is the nation look more like GLSEN today or more like GLAAD today? What we imagined. And marketers or communicators, and I think in my world that I live in, I'm driven by that. That's so important to me to think of in 20 years' time, is the society that we live in reflect those values? And board members have the power over time and patience too, to realize that vision. And I think in those cases, we've done tremendously. We've been very forward thinking. We're facing challenges today. And that's why too, I've been on boards long ago and today. I want to see much younger people, of course. I want them to take my seats and I want them to drive the next generation of change. They've got to.
I want to ask you about a challenge that I think a lot of leaders are struggling with right now that, you could interact with in either role, which is about navigating DEI. I think there are a lot of leaders who obviously have stated that they're really committed to creating, an inclusive environment inside of their organizations for their customers, that's good for business. And at the same time, they're seeing some pushback. They're seeing people asking questions on earnings calls. They're seeing, political backlash. I was at an event recently where a chief of staff from Capitol Hill said, on our side of the aisle, ESG and DEI are both four-letter words. Don't talk about that. Talk about enabling the American dream. It seems like a little bit of a mouthful and may not get the same point across. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you advise leaders to navigate that challenge, because it seems like some of them feel sort of stuck in the middle, and they want to avoid controversy. They don't want to have a social media moment that's going to distract them from their goals.
You're on the point, because this is a deep and abiding need right now to have this conversation. What we're finding, as you found out on Capitol Hill, is that some of these words are triggers. They're trigger weird and what I consider to be inappropriate, a revulsion, a reaction. If you think about the words D, E, and I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is there any sentient human being who really opposes those concepts? Equity meaning fairness, not equality necessarily, but fairness, so that we start at the same point and we are judged by our efforts, not given advantages. Affirmative action is one other word, of course, that has really gone out of play because it's off the legal jargon today. That said, what I try to do, two things. I want to mention that I've looked at a lot of research and surveys of corporate executives and DEI leaders. And what they're saying, at least, is that they haven't put the brakes or pause on their initiatives. They're still carrying out what they consider to be important, motivational, organizational reforms that make their workplaces and their marketplace more inclusive. And they're trying to do it and they're using metrics. They're still being judged by whether or not they're being able to show outcomes, productivity, retention of employees, market share, whatever it happens to be. So I don't think it's had a chilling effect on the conduct within. I think it has done a chilling effect on how they just talk about it. And I think we do have some issues of language. I think we have to give people more ways of describing it so it's not misunderstood. I've had conversations with critics and I said, you really, what does equity mean to you? And to them, many of them say to me, it means that everybody gets to rewarded the same way. I said, well, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is outcomes don't have to be equal, but we do have to find a place where people can compete in their careers and in their lives without boundaries and without barriers. Some face those. They're educational, their health, they're racial, their gender, they're all kinds, and they're very palpable. So I want corporate leaders to be able to speak to these issues as boldly as they dare, but not recklessly and frivolously. I don't want anybody just waving a flag just to make a point. In fact, I think what really offends people is that there's too much at times. There's too much, like, for example, during Pride season, there's a lot of showcasing and showing. That kind of work should be done 12 months a year. It shouldn't be consigned to one time a year. Companies can show their values in 100 different ways. And frankly, I think, Anthony, they're still doing it. I don't think that they're shying away from it. I think they're taking care in their marketing campaigns, which I think is not a bad thing.
It strikes me when we think about kind of the controversy issue. In the 90s, you gave the example of American taking that vintage ad, updating it to show same-sex couples and, using that as a way to connect. You could run an ad like that in a specialty magazine that the subscribe, or, you could reach audiences where the audience is the people you want to reach, and other people who might not like that wouldn't even necessarily know that it's out there. Now, if you took a stand like that, somebody can share it on social media and it can reach. And obviously, I think an example of that we're all familiar with is Bud Light working with the trans influencer, Dylan Mulvaney, and that becoming such a major, issue that, impacted the value of the company in a huge way. So I wonder if you could just kind of talk about that changing landscape. And I don't know, in one way there's some good things about that changing landscape. And the other way, there's some risks where it might cause companies to be more risk averse in taking stands that they want to take, but they say, oh, I can't do that one thing because now it's out there in the world and cause a major storm.
Well, that's not a untypical reaction by a company that's facing backlash. Sometimes they're told by their advisors, shut up, just walk away from this and the dust will settle and move on. Nobody likes controversy. It's distracting. Mostly it's just distracting. That's the worst thing in most cases. But silence is not a strategy. So even in Budweiser's case, they fail to re-articulate and talk about their values. You can dismiss that campaign or not dismiss it, but don't debate it. Just go back to your values and say, we're serving a product that every American or every American household can enjoy. That's all we're saying when we had a campaign that includes somebody who's different. Because differences are not a point of controversy. Differences are what we are as Americans, and celebrating them is what our brand's about. There are a lot of ways they could have said it that would have been more connecting and authentic. And that's the issue, is when you retreat entirely, you allow others to say about you, and your voice is quieted. I don't understand why a brand would do that.
It occurs to me you've worked with some really amazing business leaders over yourself being one, but these major corporate leaders, the folks you serve with. I wonder if there are any examples that you might be able to share of how, a CEO or a corporate leader has grappled with these challenges that inspired you?
Yeah, it's great to ask that because American had been over many years that brand that really I think had flown literally through a lot of turbulence to get where they are. But Marriott International, interestingly, I've worked with them for 2 decades, and they have always been seen as sort of like old school and very conservative. In some ways, like a lot of business people, they are. They're trying to build and staff and welcome people to hotels around the world. They're the largest in their space. The thing that gave me a lot of confidence and pride in leadership is their late CEO, unfortunately, is no longer with us, Arnie Sorensen. Arnie Sorensen instinctively knew that his business thrived when they made it clear that everyone was welcome. And a number of years, maybe it's 10 years ago, when we had a spate of anti-gay uh, business legislation in Indiana, in Arizona, in Georgia, that attempted to slice out civil rights provisions for LGBTQ people and say to the pizza place or to the innkeeper or to the car dealership, if you want to turn away an LGBTQ person, that's perfectly fine. That's your right. And Artie stood up at a PFLAG benefit in New York and made a lot of news that day because he said, this is insanity, because our business is to welcome all. Our business is not to turn away customers. It's to find ways to grow our customers. So he just thought it was, in fact, madness to propose or support that kind of legislation. Other businesses came along and understood that he led it, but I think a lot of other companies got the exact same point of view, and I think that business voice was extremely important.
Yeah, why is it important? Because some people say, well, why does the business community have to get involved in this stuff? But obviously, you just said it's they do. Tell me why.
In this policy area, it directly affected their business. Frankly, that's one way to think of it, is that if it defined what they do. Frankly, I think, but he also couched his language in it. He was not shy of speaking about civil rights, but he was adept at making the business case and to making it clear that when you deny or make it clear that somebody's not welcome, how will we know different than we were in the 50s or 60s when people of color were turned away from lunchrooms or hotels? There's no justification for maintaining that.
Yeah. Bob, as we kind of wrap up, there's one last question I want to ask you, which is, thinking over the course of your career and how much things have changed, what do you know now that you wish you had known when you started your company? If you could go back and give yourself advice.
Well, I have to tell you, in the reality, I spent 10 years in Capitol Hill. I was a press secretary for a senator, and I worked in policy areas, so I love that work. But I was going to say is I was a little intimidated by leaving the political sphere and going into commerce, because I had the last person in my family, Anthony, who was a businessman, was my grandfather, who came from Budapest in 1905 with $12, and he made shoes. So if he was the last example or role model I had in my family, I didn't know how to do a business. But I think that if you have passion and smarts and durability and resilience, and you believe in the kind of work you do, you can succeed. So to me, I just wish I'd learned those lessons a little earlier. I would have started this work probably in the 1980s instead of the 1990s.
And as you think about, let me just ask a follow-up on that. As you think about the work that you do, having to influence people at the highest levels about, their business strategy, it's really what you do. You shared some really good lessons around, using data and telling stories. But I wonder if there's anything else that comes to mind, lessons in terms of how you influence leaders.
Well, one thing I'd like to keep it very real and make it clear that I do understand in the world that we all live in, there's a great deal of risk, a great deal of reward. And I always like to give them confidence that we are on the side of growing the rewards. And I think that's the thing that I view my success as only if they're succeeding. So I want to make sure the people I work with feel tangible and personal and authentic professional success. And so if they're rising in the rewards and the risks are maintained or managed, then we all will succeed. And to me, our community succeeds. That's the other part, is that, in the day, I think of the LGBTQ economy means that we're contributing to all of it. The nonprofit side, the profit side, we're stakeholders, investors, we're entrepreneurs, we're consumers. I want to have us succeed in all of those identities so that we are seen for the whole person we are.
I love that. And I think what you said earlier really resonated. Yes, the reward side, but there are risks. And when there are risks, silence is not a strategy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Bob, I really appreciate you taking time. It was so good to talk to you today. And like we said earlier, you have been given many accolades and called many things, but we're really thrilled to call you Chief Influencer. So thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure and a moment of pride to talk with you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a Chief Influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.